Could one missile deal from Turkey change the way Putin sees this war? Because this story is not really about 70 missiles. It is about a country Russia thought it understood suddenly moving the board beneath Moscow's feet. Before we pull this apart, do me a quick favor. Like this video if you want sharp, no-nonsense breakdowns, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and share this with one person who follows the war as closely as you do. For more than 2 years, one of Ukraine's biggest advantages was the ability to hit deep behind Russian lines. Not just the trenches, not just the front. I mean the places commanders sleep, the places helicopters refuel, the places air defense crews think they are far enough away to breathe easy. When those places are safe, an army can move, plan, store, repair, and recover. When those places are no longer safe, the entire machine starts to feel exposed. That is why long-range strike weapons became so important in this war. They did more than blow up equipment. They changed behavior. They forced Russia to move assets farther back. They made bases less useful. They created fear in places that were supposed to be protected. And once fear enters the deep rear, it spreads. Pilots hesitate. Commanders relocate. Supply officers overcompensate. Air defenses get stretched. The front line feels it, even if the explosion happened many kilometers away. But then that pressure faded. Ukraine's stocks of ATACMS became heavily depleted. Reports said Ukraine had used these missiles only a handful of times over the past year as supplies ran low, while the United States also faced a serious shortage after the war with Iran. That matters because ATACMS was never just another weapon. It was one of the few tools that could reach into the operational rear and make Russia pay a price far from the trench line. So when fresh reports appeared saying Ukraine was buying 70 M39 ATACMS missiles from Turkey, plus 12 M270 launchers, over 2,000 cluster munitions, and 47,000 howitzer rounds, people did not react because 70 missiles sounded huge. They reacted because the message sounded huge. Turkey? That is what makes this story feel so explosive. Not just what is in the package, but who is sending it. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey also keeps economic and political ties with Moscow. Turkey has repeatedly positioned itself as a mediator in the war. It is one of the few countries that can still talk to both sides without the conversation ending immediately. So when a country like that appears in a major weapons transfer tied to Ukraine, the meaning goes beyond the hardware. It tells us the diplomatic balancing act may still exist, but the weight inside that balance is shifting. Now, we need to be precise here because precision matters. According to reports citing U.S. congressional records, this is a proposed transfer of U.S. origin weapons from Turkish inventory to Ukraine. Because the weapons are American-made, Turkey needs Washington's approval before re-exporting them. The U.S. State Department notified Congress on August 3rd, which triggered a 15-day review. Period. Unless Congress passes a joint resolution blocking the move, the transfer can proceed. That may sound like a dry legal detail, but it is actually part of the drama. This is not a rumor from some random channel. This is not a fantasy scenario built out of anonymous whispers. This is tied to formal government procedure. It entered the political system through official channels, and that instantly made people in Moscow, Kiev, Washington, and Ankara look much more closely. The package itself is not minor. The reported list includes 70 M39 ATACMS missiles and 12 M270 multiple launch rocket systems. The M270 matters because missiles are only useful if you have enough platforms to fire them. The launcher matters because it expands the number of positions from which Ukraine can strike. It complicates Russian planning. It makes hunting launchers more difficult. And in a war where Russia is always trying to find and destroy high-value systems before they fire, simply adding more possible firing points has value of its own. Then there is the ATACMS variant itself. The M39 is not the newest, flashiest version. It is the early model, with a range of around 165 kilometers. It uses inertial guidance and lacks GPS correction. Critics will jump on that immediately. They will say these are older missiles. They will say the range is shorter than later versions. They will say the numbers are too small for a war this large. And to be fair, none of those objections are crazy, but older does not mean useless, not even close. The M39 carries a cluster warhead packed with 950 M74 submunitions. That means it is not designed only for one perfectly pinpoint impact. It is built to punish area targets, parking aprons, equipment staging zones, air defense positions, fuel and logistics areas, the kinds of places where damaging many assets at once can be more valuable than destroying one single object with perfect elegance. In real war, disruption often matters as much as destruction. If one strike can scatter crews, damage multiple vehicles, and force a base to shut down operations, that effect can ripple outward for days. That is why even an older missile can be dangerous in the right hands and against the right target set. Ukraine does not need these weapons to do everything. It needs them to do specific things that still matter deeply. And there's another point people keep missing. A weapon's battlefield value is only half the story. Its political value can be just as large, sometimes bigger. Because if Turkey completes this transfer, the immediate meaning is not that Russia suddenly loses the war. The immediate meaning is that a country Moscow worked hard to keep in a gray zone is now helping Ukraine restore a capability it badly needed. That hits differently. Russia has long benefited from the idea that Turkey is complicated, careful, and too entangled to move decisively against Russian interests. And in many ways, that picture has been true. Turkey buys Russian gas, Turkey has maintained trade, Turkey has tried to preserve a mediating role, Turkey has often acted like a state determined to keep multiple doors open at once. But that strategy cuts both ways. A country that keeps many doors open can also choose, at key moments, which door matters more. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than missiles. Turkey says the purpose of the transfer is to reduce older inventory and focus resources on modernizing and sustaining its existing systems. On paper, that is a perfectly rational explanation. Old stocks cost money, storage costs money, maintenance costs money. If Ankara can turn aging equipment into financial and strategic value, that is an efficient move. But almost nothing in geopolitics is only administrative. You do not send this kind of package into a war this sensitive without understanding the signal. You do not help replenish one of Ukraine's best-known long-range strike capabilities without knowing exactly how it will be interpreted. And how will it be interpreted? In Kyiv, it will be seen as proof that useful channels still exist even when direct U.S. supplies tighten. In Washington, it will be seen as a model. If the United States is short on its own stocks, Allied inventories become more important. In Europe, it will be seen as another sign that Turkey wants a more central role in the future security order. And in Moscow, it will be seen as a warning. Not necessarily that Turkey has become a direct enemy, but that the old assumptions about Turkish restraint may no longer protect Russia the way they once did. If you're still with me, hit subscribe, tap like, and send this video to the friend who always says geopolitics is boring, because stories like this prove it can change in one document, one shipment, and one decision. To understand why this unsettles Russia so much, you have to look at how power really works in war. Power is not only tanks, shells, and manpower. It is also access, routes, partners, quiet understandings, the countries that still talk to you, the ports that still matter, the companies willing to move goods, the mediators who might one day help shape the terms of a ceasefire. Lose enough of those things, and even if you still have missiles, your strategic room begins to shrink. That is the real fear inside this story, not the fantasy that 70 missiles alone will break Russia. They will not. Anyone telling you that is overselling the case. 70 older M39 missiles are not enough to rewrite the entire battlefield. This is a long war of attrition. Huge numbers of shells, drones, missiles, vehicles, and men have already been burned through. No serious analyst should pretend this package by itself decides the outcome, but it does something else. It restores pressure where pressure had weakened. It tells Russia that deep areas may become vulnerable again. It signals that even as the war drags on, Ukraine can still find ways to reopen capabilities that looked exhausted. And it shows that the network around Ukraine is more adaptive than Moscow would like. That last point matters a lot. Wars are not won only by stockpiles. They are won by systems that learn, by coalitions that improvise, by states that find substitutes when a channel closes. The strongest wartime network is not the one with infinite resources. It is the one that keeps replacing lost options with new ones before collapse sets in. In that sense, Turkey's role here is unsettling because it represents adaptation. Washington faces shortages. Fine. Then another path is explored. The equipment sits in an ally's inventory. Legal permission is requested. Congress is notified. Private companies line up to facilitate movement. Suddenly, a frozen capability begins to thaw. That is a nightmare for any power hoping its enemy will simply run out of options. And the companies involved tell their own story. Reports say the transfer would be facilitated by Turkish firms including MKE, Asfat, and Arka Savunma, along with Bulgaria's Vitic International and U.S. firms, Pensofico and Patriot Defense Group. That means this is not just about one state making a symbolic gesture. It is about a cross-border chain of logistics and defense actors turning a political decision into something operational. When war support becomes routine through companies and procedures, it becomes harder to dismiss as a one-off headline. That is why first moves matter so much. The first deal is never only the first deal, it is also a test of mechanism. Can it be approved? Can it be arranged? Can it be moved? Can it be politically defended? If the answer is yes, then the strategic importance goes beyond the first package because the pathway now exists. Other transfers become easier to imagine. This is where Putin's problem starts to look more serious. Russia does have ways to pressure Turkey. It can use rhetoric, it can complain, it can try to increase friction in trade, tourism, or energy discussions. It can send warnings through media and diplomatic channels. But Moscow's options are limited by its own dependence. Turkey still matters too much. Turkey is not just another country on Russia's map. It is tied to energy flows. It is part of regional commerce. It is a gateway state in multiple senses at once. It matters in the Black Sea. It matters in sanctions-era trade patterns. It matters diplomatically because Ankara can still speak to actors who do not all speak to one another. That does not mean Turkey controls everything. It means Turkey occupies a position Russia cannot casually throw away. And that creates a strange imbalance. Moscow may dislike the move intensely, but punishing Turkey too hard would damage Russian interests too. It is hard to coerce a country when you also need that country for your own strategic flexibility. That is why the title idea of Putin being powerless is emotionally understandable, even if we should translate it into more careful language. Russia is not literally powerless. Large states with military, economic, and diplomatic tools are never powerless. But in this specific situation, the Kremlin's clean response options are narrow. Its freedom to retaliate without cost is limited. Its ability to reverse the underlying shift is weaker than it would like to admit. And in geopolitics, that kind of constrained anger can be more revealing than open strength. Think about what Russia would prefer. It would prefer a Turkey that stays profitable, cautious, and neutral enough to avoid helping Ukraine in any deeply meaningful new way. It would prefer a Turkey that mediates, trades, and occasionally criticizes the West while keeping hard military support to Kiev within predictable limits. That was a manageable Turkey. What Russia may now be seeing is a Turkey that still speaks the language of balance, but is gradually redefining what balance actually means. That is a profound difference. Because a traditional balancing power tries to avoid tipping the scale too far. But a balancing power can also move the scale one click at a time while pretending the center is unchanged. That is often how major strategic realignments happen. Not with one dramatic declaration, not with one thunderous speech, but with a sequence of choices that look technical in isolation and transformative in accumulation. One deal, one approval, one shipment, one military partnership, one diplomatic initiative, one change in the expectation of what this country is willing to do. And slowly, the old mental map stops matching reality. That is why people in Moscow should care, even if these missiles are older, even if the numbers are limited, and even if Turkey continues doing business with Russia tomorrow morning. Because the story is not that Ankara has become anti-Russian in some simple emotional sense. The story is that Ankara may be positioning itself for a future in which a weaker Russia must be managed, not feared. That future thinking is what smart states do. They do not only react to the current battlefield, they prepare for the negotiation table that comes after it. And that is where Turkey's move becomes especially sharp. If the war eventually ends through talks, who will matter? The countries that sent aid will matter. The countries that control routes will matter. The countries that maintained communication channels will matter. The countries that can claim they helped shape survival without fully burning their own diplomatic bridges will matter a great deal. Turkey clearly understands this, and now imagine how that looks from the Kremlin. You are fighting a grinding war. Your opponents are trying to outlast you. Your assumptions about Western fatigue are real but not absolute. The United States is strained. Europe is uneven. Supplies are tight. Yet, instead of Ukraine quietly losing options, new pathways begin opening through a NATO member you cannot simply isolate. That is not catastrophic in one day. But it is deeply annoying in a way that signals something larger. Let me put it this way. In long wars, the side under pressure does not collapse only because of giant events. Sometimes the bigger damage comes from repeated proof that the pressure is not going away. Repeated proof that safe zones are not fully safe. Repeated proof that partner networks still function. Repeated proof that the future may contain more surprises, not fewer. That psychological effect matters. War is material, yes, but it is also mental. It is about what commanders expect tomorrow to look like. If Russian planners begin assuming that deeper rear assets may again come under threat, they have to adjust. Adjustment means moving resources, changing deployments, shifting defenses, and spending energy on protection instead of pure offensive output. That alone can make a transfer valuable before a single missile is fired. And once missiles are fired, the meaning can grow. Picture the practical military logic. A 165-kilometer missile with a cluster payload does not need to reach every target in Russia to be meaningful. It only needs to reach the right kinds of targets within the relevant zone. Aircraft on aprons, storage areas, troop concentrations, air defense positions, forward logistics hubs. If those targets are forced to move, disperse, harden, or hide, Russia pays a tax. Maybe not a war-ending tax, but a real one. That tax can show up in slower operations, lower sortie generation, more fuel burned in relocation, more pressure on already stretched air defenses, more uncertainty in command planning. War is full of hidden taxes. Smart weapons are often valuable because they impose them. And remember, Ukraine already understands how to use this family of systems. This is not some exotic platform that needs years of training from zero. Ukraine has operated launchers in this ecosystem before. The learning curve is not nothing, but it is far from starting cold. That shortens the gap between transfer and battlefield effect. Now, there's another uncomfortable truth here, and it is one many audiences do not like hearing. A lot of geopolitical influence today does not come from perfect loyalty. It comes from useful ambiguity. Turkey has mastered that for years. It talks to NATO, it talks to Russia, it sells, mediates, bargains, resists, cooperates, and recalculates. That frustrates many observers because it makes Turkey hard to classify. But being hard to classify is often a source of leverage. If you are fully predictable, everyone prices you in. If you are strategically ambiguous but still disciplined, other powers keep watching. They keep wondering what you might do next. That uncertainty can be converted into influence. And perhaps that is what makes this move feel unthinkable to some viewers. Not that Turkey is suddenly becoming something completely new, but that it is using its old flexibility in a new direction at a very sensitive moment. Quick pause before we go further. If this breakdown is giving you a clearer picture than the headlines do, like the video, subscribe for more deep analysis in plain English, and share it so more people can see how the real story hides behind the loudest title. Now let's tackle the biggest counter-argument head-on. What if this is being exaggerated? Fair question. Maybe the deal is approved but delayed. Maybe logistics stretch out. Maybe only part of the package matters quickly. Maybe the older M39s prove less effective than some supporters hope. Maybe Russian defenses adapt. Maybe the strategic symbolism ends up larger than the physical impact. All of that is possible. But even if we take the most cautious interpretation, the story still matters. Why? Because it exposes three realities at once. First, Ukraine's search for long-range strike options is still active. That alone tells us Kyiv is not resigning itself to a purely defensive future. Second, the US-led security ecosystem is learning how to operate through allied inventories when direct supply becomes difficult. Third, Turkey is comfortable enough with the possible Russian reaction to let this process move into the open. That third point may be the most important of all. Countries do not do sensitive things in the open unless they have already weighed the risks. Ankara knows Moscow will notice. Ankara knows global media will notice. Ankara knows analysts will read this as more than inventory management. If it still proceeds, that tells you Turkish leaders believe the benefits outweigh the fallout. And what are those benefits? Some are practical. Turning older equipment into value, supporting modernization, strengthening defense industry relevance, demonstrating that Turkish-linked firms can sit inside major wartime supply chains. Some are political, reinforcing Turkey's centrality inside the wider Western security conversation without completely surrendering an independent line. Some are strategic, building credit with Ukraine and with partners who want Kyiv sustained, while also shaping Turkey's future position in the Black Sea order that will emerge after the war. Those benefits are not abstract. They are exactly the kinds of gains middle powers seek when they want to punch above their weight. And that is the real lesson of this story. Great powers do not have a monopoly on shaping wars. Sometimes regional powers with the right geography, the right industries, the right diplomatic channels, and the right timing can shift the entire discussion. That does not mean they control the outcome, but they can change the pressure points. Turkey is one of those states. Its geography matters, its NATO membership matters, its ties with Russia matter, its defense industry matters, its image as both participant and mediator matters. When a state sits at the intersection of so many systems, even a single arms transfer can create strategic noise far larger than its price tag. Speaking of price, reports link the package to an original acquisition value of around $280 million. Again, that is not necessarily the final sale price, but even that figure tells you something. This is not a symbolic handful of crates. This is a meaningful transfer with real military content and real administrative weight behind it. And yet, the most dangerous thing about it for Moscow may still be its precedent. Precedent is where states get nervous, because precedent is how exceptions become patterns. If Turkey can do this once, what else becomes imaginable later? More re-exports, more indirect support models, more creative arrangements through companies and allied inventories, more military cooperation that stays below the threshold of full strategic rupture, but still hurts Russian interests? Those questions are uncomfortable because they widen the horizon. They make the story less about one package and more about a proof of concept. And once a proof of concept exists, every future shortage looks less final. Think back to one of the key emotional beats in this whole war. Whenever people believe one side has finally run out of options, the conflict produces another workaround. Drones replace shells in one area. Domestic production increases somewhere else. Old systems are revived. New suppliers emerge. Training pipelines. Adapt. Improvisation becomes doctrine. That cycle is one reason this war has lasted so long. Both sides keep finding ways to extend their staying power. That is also why stories like this matter. They are not isolated headlines. They are signs of which network is still managing to regenerate. So is Putin powerless? Not in the absolute sense. We should be smarter than that. Russia still has enormous destructive capability. It still has escalation tools. It still has resources, influence, and the ability to make this war even more brutal. Anyone who treats Russia as helpless is not analyzing. They are performing. But is Putin constrained here? Yes, very much so. Constrained by dependence on Turkey, constrained by the legal and political visibility of the transfer, constrained by the reality that striking back too hard against Ankara could harm Russian interests beyond this one issue, constrained by the broader fact that Ukraine's support system keeps finding alternative channels. That kind of constraint matters because leaders do not need to be powerless to be frustrated. They only need to face a situation in which the clean response they want is not available. And that is exactly what makes this moment so revealing. Russia can rage, it can warn, it can posture. But can it stop the deeper message from landing? That is harder. The deeper message is simple. Countries that once seemed carefully suspended between East and West are making new calculations. Not all at once, not with theatrical declarations, but through real decisions with military consequences. That is how strategic isolation develops. Quietly first, unevenly, through friction, through disappointment, through the slow realization that every supposedly stable relationship now comes with new conditions. If you are Moscow, that is dangerous because it affects the war after the war. It affects who will invest in reconstruction, who will broker talks, who will shape shipping, who will set terms in the Black Sea, who will provide systems, who will supply routes, and who will be heard when the map of regional security gets redrawn. Turkey wants to be in that room. More than that, Turkey wants to be impossible to ignore in that room. And moves like this are how you buy your seat before the conference even begins. That is why this is not just a military story, it is a future order story. It is about who is preparing for the next phase, while everyone else is still arguing about the current one. It is about a state selling older missiles, yes, but it is also about a state investing in relevance, and relevance is one of the most valuable currencies in international politics. Now bring it all together. 70 M39, ATACMS, 12 M270 launchers, over 2,000 cluster munitions, 47,000 howitzer rounds, a U.S. review mechanism already triggered, a NATO member using its inventory to help Ukraine regain a long-range punch, an ally network improvising around shortage, a Russia that can complain loudly but cannot act freely without hurting itself. That is why the story feels bigger than the numbers. Because sometimes the most important thing a weapons package changes is not the map today, it is the expectations for tomorrow. And expectations shape wars, they shape planning, they shape fear, they shape alliances, they shape who thinks time is on their side. If Russia thought time and fatigue would slowly close Ukraine's options, this reported transfer sends the opposite signal. It says options can reopen. It says shortages can be worked around. It says even countries balancing between rival blocs may still choose moments that hurt Moscow in concrete ways. That does not mean the war is decided. Far from it. The battlefield will remain brutal, uncertain, and costly. Old missiles are still old missiles. Deliveries still take time. Legal processes still matter. Russia will still adapt. Ukraine will still face hard limits. But that is exactly why this matters. In a war where every side is struggling to maintain momentum, even limited restorations of lost capability can matter out of proportion to their size. And in a war where political signals are constantly tested, a move from Turkey lands with unusual force. Because it tells every observer the same thing. The board is still moving, the assumptions are still changing, and some of the countries Putin counted on to remain safely complicated are becoming complicated in ways that favor Ukraine. That may be the most important point of all, not that Turkey has chosen one side forever, not that 70 missiles solve everything, not that Russia has no cards left, but that the war keeps producing moments where Moscow discovers its leverage was smaller than it thought, its partners were more independent than it hoped, and its room to answer was narrower than its image of power suggested. That is the kind of realization that does not explode on impact like a missile. It sinks in slowly, and sometimes, for a power used to forcing outcomes, that slower shock is the one that hurts most. Before this ends, one last thing. If you want more scripts and breakdowns that cut through noise and get to the real pressure points, like the video, subscribe right now, and share this with someone who cares about where this war is heading next. So when people ask whether Turkey just did the unthinkable, the real answer is this. The missiles matter, but The message matters more. The message is that Russia's war is not only draining men and machines, it is draining certainty. Certainty that some partners will stay still, certainty that shortages will trap Ukraine, certainty that balancing states will always balance in ways that protect Moscow, certainty that time only works in Russia's favor. That certainty is now under attack too. And when certainty starts to break, power starts to look different. Not weaker everywhere. Not finished overnight, but less absolute, less feared, less able to control every move around. That is why this story will echo far beyond one shipment. Because, in the end, the most dangerous thing for the Kremlin may not be 70 older missiles. It may be the realization that the countries around this war are already preparing for a future in which Russia has fewer choices, less leverage, and a much harder time pushing the scale back in its favor.